In today's episode, join detoxification expert and founder of Remedylink, Spencer Feldman. Spencer breaks down the 4 classes of toxins, the different detox traps that can get people into trouble, how to offset calcification of our tissues, and why it is so important to increase our cellular voltage in order to heal. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show. And we continue on with our little mini series on detoxification. Today, we bring in Spencer Feldman. And Spencer is the owner and creator of a company called Remedylink, where they specifically focus on detox primarily. And a lot of products around metal detox in particular, but they also look at things like calcification and oxalates and some of these different things that you might not think about so much. So I wanted to bring Spencer on because they create a lot of unique products that are in the realm of suppositories. So you don't see a lot of times suppositories for metal detoxification and other products for detoxification, but they actually make a lot of sense. And we get into some of that as to why you might actually prefer to do detox suppositories as opposed to oral or chelation therapy and the pros and cons around those things. We get into a lot of information around detox. He shares with us the different classes of toxins. He talks specifically around the detox traps that people get into and why sometimes people go through some really bad reactions when they are detoxifying. It's not always a healing crisis. Sometimes people actually get worse. And so you need to understand these different detox traps in order to do it properly when you decide to detox. We talk about heavy metals. We get into oxalates. We talk about calcification of the tissue. This is a big deal. A lot of times people don't realize how many troubles we can have with calcification. And our tissues tend to calcify as we age. So how do we offset that and what can we do to work with it? We also get into an area called voltage, and we talk about the importance of cellular voltage and raising voltage, some of the different things that lower voltage and how that makes it very hard for our bodies to heal. I really enjoyed chatting with Spencer, and I hope you guys really enjoy this episode. Check out the links below for our sponsors, C60 from Purple Power, and make sure you use promo code DRLOKEN in order to get 15% off. C60 is the most powerful antioxidant that we know of. And antioxidants are incredibly important to have in our bodies, especially dealing with oxidative load that our bodies get overwhelmed with a lot of times just living in the world. Now, one of the things that's unique with C60 is that they are compounded in a carrier oil. And I've had people asking me, which oil do I use? And so the 3 main oils that C60 uses are MCT oil, olive oil, and avocado oil. Now, each one of them is a great oil. They're all organic. They're made with 100% certified organic oils. They're very high quality. You can use any of them. Personally, I rotate through all the different oils. I've used all of them, and I don't really have one specific preference. I like to move them around. Now, you can get more C60 packed on the avocado as well as the olive oil because they are a longer chain fat. MCT oil is a shorter chain fat, so you can't get as much C60 on that oil. So if you want to get the same dosage of C60, you might have to increase a little bit more. Rather than doing maybe 1 teaspoon, you might need to move up to 1.5 teaspoons or 2 teaspoons. But the benefit of the MCT oil is that you get the benefits of MCT oil. So MCT has got a lot of benefits as far as helping us get into ketosis, helping us to mobilize fat for energy. So it's got a lot of other benefits attached to it. So you can play with both of them, try them out, ultimately see what feels best on your body. That's what I'm kind of doing more than anything. I like to test certain markers when I can, but I really want to pay attention to how do different things feel in my body. And really honor that and then experiment with it. So try out the different oils and see which one works best for you. And then write in and let me know what you find. But all 3 of them you can use. Sometimes I will get all of them and just rotate them around at different times. Make sure you use promo code DRLOKEN in capitals for 15% off your order. Now, the other thing around detoxification is not just the things we take to detoxify, but it's also minimizing the load. So check out the mycotoxin and mold-free coffee from Ascent Nutrition below. Again, use promo code DRLOKEN for 10% off your order. Mycotoxins are a big deal. I've talked about them a lot in the past. If you drink coffee, chances are if it is not tested to have low levels of mold or mycotoxins or literally no detectable levels, then you are likely getting some mold and mycotoxins in your coffee. Try it out and see. Coffee, along with a lot of grains, is a very big way that people can get mycotoxins into their system that they don't want to. So try it out and see if you notice a difference. Use the promo code DRLOKEN for 10% off your order. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast. And today's guest is Spencer Feldman. Spencer is the founder of Remedylink, where for the last 20 years, he has been formulating and manufacturing detoxification products for doctors and their patients. His company specializes in helping support your body's natural responses to heavy metal toxins. Spencer's now in his 50s, and he lives with his partner completely off-grid on his 100-acre farm, where he spends his time tending his orchard and garden while continuing to design new products to help detoxify people. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here. When I came across your work, I was thinking you're going to be a great guest to dive into this complex topic of detoxification. So we've kind of been in the middle of a couple of series, and I want to do a mini series specifically on how to support the physical body. And I think detox is something that a lot of people jump into, but they don't really understand all of the nuances of it and maybe don't get the benefits and might even create some damage if they're not doing it properly.
Yeah, the body has an innate capacity to remove toxins, metals, chemicals. We were exposed to poisonous mushrooms and snake bites and spider bites and, arsenic in water supplies for, millions of years. So we have that capacity built in. But in our modern environment, there's so much that we're exposed to. And, you'll hear people say, well, all of these chemicals and all these things in our environment, the pesticides, the solvents, the cleaning agents, they've all been tested to be safe. And that's true. Any individual one of them is tested, perhaps not to cause problems, but what has never been tested is all of these millions of things happening simultaneously. And, we know in the modern medical world, drugs will cross-react, and there are certain drugs that are contraindicated to be taken together. Well, we've never done a contraindication test for the millions of things we're exposed to. And that's why I think a lot of people now are not experiencing the kind of health that's their birthright, because they are exposed to a lot of things. It's hard to figure out which one is causing the problem. And a lot of people aren't presented with really good solutions for how to support the natural detox systems of the body.
I think that's such an incredibly important point, because that seems to be what happens for most health problems. It's this accumulation, and it's hard to say, it's like stresses, what was the final stress that pushed you over the edge? A lot of times it's this buildup that's been going on and on and on. You think about as far as toxin goes, I was talking about a study that was done by the Environmental Working Group, I think back in '95, where they looked at the cord blood of newborns, and they found that they had essentially over 200 different toxins in the cord blood right from birth. So that's without even being exposed to the world around us. So the idea that we can even be completely toxin free, I think, is probably not actually possible at this point. But if we can lower the load, and because we don't know the interactions of all of these different things, it's such an important point. You might hear them say, well, this has been shown to be safe, and this has been shown to be safe, and this has been shown to be safe, but nothing has been done when you put them all together and have this big hodgepodge of all of these things together, and nobody knows what that's going to do.
They'll add a chemical at levels just before it starts to cause problems. A little and 1% more, and now we start the side effects. Okay, great, that one's safe. But if you're right at the edge, and then you add 1,000 things right at the edge, so you're right. We're never going to be completely non-toxic. But you mentioned newborns, and I think it's really important. If you are planning on having kids, that's a great time to start doing a detox 6 months before you want to have children, because that way the sperm for the father and the body of the mother is as toxin free as possible, and it doesn't get passed on, because we know there are some toxins that will definitely pass on through the placental wall. So what I'd like to do is go over the classes of toxins to try to give people a 20,000 foot view of the whole scene of what toxicity is about, how to understand it conceptually, and then you can start working on, what kind of protocol you want to put together for yourself. And in that light, the view I would give to people is there's different classes of toxins. You have water-soluble toxins, fat-soluble toxins, toxic metals, and toxic crystallizations. And You could also say in that, you could also put the chemical toxins, which are mostly going to be the fat soluble ones. But so let's start talking about these and the traps that we can fall into. So we begin with water soluble toxins, and these are things that you can simply urinate out. So all you really need is some water. Now, most of us don't drink enough water, and that's usually because either the water is really poor quality tap water and the body is just saying, no, this is putting all sorts of chlorinated things in me that I don't want. Or the person's low on water-soluble vitamins and electrolytes, and so the more water they drink, the more they crash their water-soluble vitamins and electrolytes, and the body is caught between trying to balance dehydration and deficiencies. So the solution to both of these is good quality water and maybe add a few B and C vitamins, and that'll usually get people drinking. What I do is I add a little bit of lemon juice to my spring water, and then I can drink it all day long. So we don't have to worry so much about the water soluble, though. You just have to deal with the damage it leaves, but it's not going to hang around. The next kind of toxins are the fat-soluble toxins, and these you can't just urinate out because they end up in the fatty tissue of the body, and that's things like the nerves and the brain and the cellular membranes. And some of them will get removed. The body does have the capacity; they'll get removed in the bile, but that means that you have to have a functioning liver and gallbladder, and you have to have enough fiber and not to have it reabsorb. And we'll get into that in a minute. The real trick for dealing with the fat-soluble toxins is to turn them into the water-soluble versions. We make them water-soluble, and there's a process that we do every day at that. And that's, dish soap and laundry detergent. So if you take a dish, it's full of grease, and you just dunk it in water, the grease isn't coming off. But if you dunk it in soapy water, it will. What happens is the soap is that chemical agent that will combine with the grease and make it water-soluble so it can rinse off. So to get rid of fat-soluble toxins, you have to first make them water-soluble. And that's really the first takeaway, is what we're looking for is a kind of soap. And different toxins require different soaps. We're making them so we can rinse them away. And the most well-known way to make toxins water-soluble is with something called a coffee enema. Have you ever tried that?
I haven't actually done a coffee enema myself, but I'm well aware of the work on it.
Okay, so let me give you the background for coffee enemas. Is this an interesting story? So the scene is World War I field hospital in Germany. And it was thought at the time that it was important to give an enema, as long as it wasn't a gut shot, to someone who is going to go through surgery because, well, one, it makes the bowels easier to manipulate if you have to get in and move the viscera around to deal with bleeding somewhere else. But the other is it was believed that it would cause decrease the bacterial load in the patient and make it easier for the recovery. So what happened was the nurse goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, we're out of hot water. We can't give this patient an enema." And the doctor looks around and goes, "Over there, use the coffee. We have enough coffee." And she's like, "All right, you're the doctor, fine." And so they give the soldier the coffee enema. And what they noticed was that that patient, that soldier, recovered faster and with much less pain than was expected. And this is why I have such great respect for German biological medicine, is because they're very practical and very observant. And so they said, all right, let's start doing this with all of our patients. And that became the de facto way of doing it. And now what we understand, and so that was the birth of the coffee enema. For those of you who don't know, a coffee enema is exactly what it sounds like. You brew up a quart of coffee and you put it in an enema bag and you lay in the bathtub and lay on your side, put the enema bag in, and you hold for half an hour, as much coffee as you can. This is a very popular naturopathic protocol for, last century, but a lot of people don't want to do it because, it's not comfortable to do a coffee enema. But what does it do? So let's talk about that. What it does is it stimulates something called phase 1 detox, which is where there are some enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes. And what they do is they add an oxygen to a fat-soluble toxin, and that makes it more reactive. And then the next step is where phase 2 happens, which is where some conjugators like glutathione get attached to the oxygen. And now that toxin is water-soluble and you can urinate it out. But some people don't get those results that they used to. A lot of the old naturopathic technologies don't work as well. And some people even get worse when you do a coffee enema. So let's talk about why that happens, because it's a trap. What happens is phase 1 makes the toxins temporarily more reactive with that oxygen molecule. Now, if someone does not have any phase or enough of the phase 2 or the right type of phase 2 conjugators, then what happens is they have this chemical in them that is now more reactive than it was before, and it's causing more problems. And this is how people get multiple chemical sensitivities, right? They have a phase 1, but no phase 2. Their phase 2 has crashed. And this, I had multiple chemical sensitivities. If I'm driving in a car, if I was in a car and there was a diesel truck in front of me and I didn't roll the windows and put the recirculator on fast enough and I breathed in some diesel fumes, I'd be a mess for half an hour at least. I would just tell people in the car with me, look, don't talk to me. I'm going to be in a terrible mood. I'm going to feel terrible. You can't help me. I just got to wait this out. And, some people it's cigarette smoke. Some people it's perfume. Some people it's cleaning products. They have a crash on their phase 2. And this is one of the first detox trap I'm referring to. It's where someone tries to stimulate phase 1, because a lot of the detox products out there are great phase 1 stimulators, but they don't supply phase 2 at the same time. And most people don't have enough phase 2 because of, as we said before, we've been exposed to so many more toxins than we were ever designed to, or our body ever expected to have. And the food's less nutritious. So now as a result, you stimulate phase 1 without phase 2, you're going to get people ill and not get the results you're looking for. So I'm looking at these two problems. I'm saying people don't want to do coffee enemas. And we've got to add in the phase 2 conjugators. So what I did is I made some suppositories called Zenaplex, which have organic coffee for phase 1. And then I added in every phase 2 conjugator I could find. So that's the methyl groups, the sulfates, glucuronic acid, glutathione, acetyl groups. And then we've got them both there at the same time. And we get a lot of success with it. And, personally, my multiple chemical sensitivities is down to maybe 5% and something like that. Like, I still don't like being exposed to diesel fume. It still doesn't feel good, but, it doesn't make me, affect me psychologically, and it doesn't knock me out for 2 hours. And my partner, like if I'm outside and I'm maybe, putting on some paint onto a propane tank or something, and I get some on me, or I'm sealing up some PVC pipes because they look off grid, and I get some glue on me, and I come in, she's like, oh my God, quick, take a Zenaplex. And I'm like, well, you know what? I don't even need to so much anymore. I've gotten my body to the point where, yeah, if I feel really sick, I will. But I'm at the point now where I don't like being exposed to toxic metals, but it doesn't get me really ill like it used to. And, that's a real gift for me. And then also for the people we've kind of walked through this with.
It's always nice when you get to the point where you realize that too, right? I mean, I was the bubble boy when I was growing up. I was allergic to like everything, even like anaphylaxis stuff. I'd end up in the hospital in an oxygen tent and Ventolin inhaler and all that kind of stuff growing up. And over the years, they just, once I actually figured out, and it was, so much stuff was related to foods and lots of other things. And once that stuff started to get cleaned up, it was like my environmental allergies, like my seasonal allergies, like hay fever stuff, just started to substantially go down. And it was literally like it just, these symptoms just kind of disappear that were such a part of your life for a long time when that stuff gets cleaned up. Now, again, would I want to be trapped in a carpety room with a cat for a long period of time? No, but I could probably handle it a lot better now for a period of time than I could have before. So, resilience builds, and this is kind of when I think about, you don't want to be having to live your life feeling like you're moving around the world in a bubble. But if you can build that, and you've got some more resilience to work with things, but then you can still make conscious choices to avoid certain things that you can maintain that resilience.
Yeah, you and I both have recovered our homeostasis, our ability to handle insults, without, our body can get pushed and we regain balance. We don't fall over. And really that's the job of the alternative medical community in a lot of ways, is to regain or get their clients' homeostasis back online so that they can live a normal world. Yes, you should expose yourself to toxins, but you should be able to handle them if you do, and then have the skill set to know how to get them out as quickly as you can after. So, that's the water soluble toxics, the fat soluble toxins. The next kind of set of toxins would be toxic metals. And now some people call them heavy metals, and a heavy metal is technically, scientifically speaking, a metal with a density or a specific gravity greater than water. So lead is a heavy metal, right? But so is zinc and so is iron, and they're good for you. So aluminum is a light metal and it's bad for you. Right. So the density is kind of misleading. So let's call them toxic metals. That's a better way to refer to them. And what happens is they look like things that are nutritional. They look like things the body wants. And so they get in and then they stay there because the body thinks it needs them. So for instance, lead looks like calcium. So that's why you find lead in the bones. And people who are calcium deficient end up with much worse lead toxicity when they're exposed to lead because their body's craving it. Cadmium looks like zinc. So you'll see cadmium end up in the prostate. So, aluminum looks like magnesium. You'll see it in the muscles and the brain, and so forth and so on. Mercury looks like selenium. It'll go to the thyroid. So, these toxic metals get stuck in our tissue, but they also get stuck in someplace very specific called the cell membrane transporters, which are these like little tunnels or revolving doors, depending on the type, that are in the cell membranes, and they bring nutrition into the cell and they take toxins or waste products out. And the toxic metals can look a lot like the nutritional metals that are trying to get passed in, but they're slightly different in size and electrical charge, so they can get stuck inside the transporters. And now the transporters don't work. So now the nutrition can't get in and the toxins can't get out. So, I mean, imagine if someone, was living in a house and then someone came along and chained shut their refrigerator and poured concrete into their toilet. So they couldn't get the waste out of the house and they couldn't get the nutrition out of the fridge. They wouldn't be doing too well. And so that's what toxic metals have a tendency to do. So what we need to do is the same thing we did with the fat soluble things. We need to find a soap. We need to find some way to get these metals out, except instead of necessarily making them fat soluble, it's a different process. The process is called chelation. We're trying to introduce something to the body that will bind to the metals more strongly than our body does to rip them off. And then that process makes them water soluble kind of by default, depending on the chelator, and then you can urinate them out. Now, my favorite chelator for this is something called EDTA, or ethylene diamine tetracetic acid. And ethylene is the gas that makes, that fruit ripens with, and diamine, that's kind of like protein, and tetra is 4, and acetic acid is vinegar. So really, it's sort of like this kind of banana protein vinegar mix, to be, non-scientific about it. And anyhow, it does a really great job of binding to things, and it's incredibly non-toxic. It's wonderful stuff. And it's usually given by IV. Things are given by IV, not because the doctor wants to poke you in the arm, because it's invasive and uncomfortable, and there's always risk. But there's a lot of ingredients that don't survive digestion, so you have to inject them or take them IV. And EDTA, most chelators don't survive digestion because they're proteins. Now, I taught myself how to do IVs on my own arm, and I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. My arms were a bloody mess by the time I was done. I mean, my partner looked at me and was like, "What did you do?" I'm like, "Well, I can do IVs now." She's like, "Okay, stop now. That's enough." Anyway, so what we did is we put EDTA into a suppository. So a lot of our products are suppositories. For instance, the coffee enema Zenaplex that we made is a suppository, right? Because we're trying to recreate the coffee enema, so we make it as a suppository. And there's a few reasons you could do a suppository. One is location. So in the case of the Zenaplex, we're right by the liver. And one is if the ingredients would be destroyed by the digestion. So the Zenaplex is glutathione. You can't take it orally, it gets destroyed. And the metacardium, which is our EDTA suppository, it also would be destroyed, taken orally. So, there's a lot of people out there that'll sell you oral chelators. Most of them won't survive digestion. So anyway, we put that in a suppository. However, and it'll bind to EDTA will bind to all sorts of metals, but just a caveat: if you're dealing with mercury, there's a very specific way you have to do it, and the reason is most chelators, when they bind to mercury, won't bind to it irreversibly. They'll bind on the mercury, but then if they see like oxidized iron or hexavalent chromium, and we have oxidized iron in our blood, right? When blood has a 120-day lifespan or whatever, when it breaks down, the heme comes out, and that iron exposed to oxygen can oxidize, turn to rust. If that oxidized iron bumps into a chelator that already has mercury, the chelator will let go of the mercury and grab the oxidized iron. Now, what can happen is someone has some mercury, say, in some abdominal fat, where it's not causing too much of an issue. They take a chelator, it binds to the abdominal fat mercury, it's getting ready to leave, and then boom, it bumps into a iron oxide, lets go of the mercury, takes the iron oxide, and now the mercury moves around and lodges, say, someplace worse like the brain. You've made this client worse because you've moved the mercury from an innocuous place like the abdominal fat into a critical place like the brain. So, that's another detox trap. When So, we don't have time to get into it in this podcast because it's a long conversation, but there is a way to safely detox mercury. There is a chelator that will bind to it and not let go of it. So if you're dealing with mercury specifically, a small amount, don't worry about too much, because if you take some EDTA, even if lets go of the mercury for some iron, the next little bit of EDTA will be there to grab the mercury. But if you're dealing with a significant mercury load, there's a specific way to do it. So, again, we make it as a suppository. So if you don't want to stick a needle in your arm or teach yourself how to do that, which I don't recommend, you can go the suppository route. So have you had, what have been your experiences using chelation in your practice?
I find a lot of times, well, one thing that I have been looking at the last the last few years, is I'll often measure markers like zinc and copper, and I often find those things are quite out of balance. And I find a lot of times zinc is notoriously low in a lot of people. And one thing that I've been finding is that one of the aspects that I always want to get online first, that I think is one of the ways that the body naturally works with metal metabolism, is with metallothionein production. So
Sure.
a lot of times what I'll find is that I want to make sure that naturally we get, and metallothionein is very zinc dependent. So I want to make sure that I've got adequate amounts of zinc, usually in a better relationship with copper first. And if I get that up, then I know I'm supporting metallothionein production, which tends to want to then work with naturally regulating metal balance. So that's usually my first step with it. And then outside of that, I would agree. Actually, I really like the idea of using the suppositories, because I'm not a fan of doing a lot of chelation. I also find part of the problem with IV chelation, even though I know you can pull a lot of stuff out at times, but there's certain, like you had mentioned, there's always certain things you want to avoid if you don't have to do IV kind of chelation. I try to avoid it if I don't have to do it. And also the other problem is that a lot of times when people do an IV chelation, they pull out the metals, but they also pull out a lot of the nutrients as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of times then I find you get a lot of stuff out, but you also become severely depleted in other nutrients. So I find there's depending on where the person is, you have to be careful with all of that stuff.
That's some really good points. One of the things I like about chelating metals out and pulling out chemicals is that it takes the burden off the metallothionein. It takes the burden off these things, so that then they can go and do all the other things like to have the metallothionein simply remove metals when it has other purposes.
Yeah.
So I like to have the brute force of going in there to dredge out all the heavy chemicals, so then the body could then come in and do the fine work. When you're doing an IV chelation, you've really got to be careful of someone's kidneys, because you're dumping out a lot of toxins over a course of 2 hours. I actually prefer to do suppositories for chelation, because it allows me to do the equivalent of an IV more slowly. So if 4 or 5 suppositories is the equivalent of 1 IV, you're being much more gentle, and you're not overwhelming the kidneys. And then, because the people who have metal toxicity often have very damaged kidneys, chelation is a spectacular way to repair the kidneys if you do it slowly, and a way to actually to damage them if you do it too fast.
Yeah.
So suppository is a slower, more gentle way to get the same thing done. Yeah.
That's what I like about the use of suppositories as well. I generally would say across the board, very seldom does anybody do better when you go faster. Most people need to do it slow and steady, even though they might want to go faster, but the body doesn't usually like to do that. It usually takes a period of time for the body to get to a certain point. You don't want to just super speed it to get through. There's sometimes some ramifications that happen to the body if you try and push things too fast. So I like the process of using the suppositories for that reason.
Yeah,
but I don't see there's not a lot of products out there as suppositories for this type of work. So it's one of the things I liked about Remedylink was when I saw the suppositories, I thought that's a great way to incorporate this type of work.
Yeah, we're actually the longest running alternative suppository manufacturing company in the country. So there's a story about a neighbor's friend who drank some solvent from that someone put in a fridge in a work site. Who put solvent in a water bottle in a fridge? Anyway, the guy was in a coma, and we got glutathione IV into him, and he woke up during the IV, and he fully recovered. And when I saw the power of glutathione, that's why I decided to make Zenaplex. And so, yeah, so there are times when, an IV is the way to go. I mean, you get somebody who's, in the hospital and you've got to move really quickly because they're having brain damage. But shy of that, I've taken some people who were told that they would be dead in a month, and we've cleaned them out well enough that they were without symptoms within that month, to the doctor's surprise, using suppositories. So yeah, there's very few things that you can't do with suppositories. The next one I wanted to talk about would be toxic crystallizations, and that's something that you don't hear talked about that much. There are at least 22 substances that I can name that will crystallize in the human body, and I'm sure there's hundreds more that we haven't even found yet. But let's talk about some of the most common ones so your audience can kind of understand the concept. And the most common ones would be gallstones and kidney stones, and then I guess crystallizations in the joints too. So let's talk about gallstones first, which is very common, especially for females. And if you ever get an ultrasound, I have an ultrasound, and I'll just look in people's bodies just for fun. And because it's or to see what's going on for them. So sometimes they'll take it over to parties, family gatherings. I'm like, hey, would you like to take a look inside your gallbladder? And well, I actually found 2 children that had Hashimoto's that way.
Oh wow.
Anyway, yeah. So anyway, yeah, the thyroid was all lit up.
Yeah.
So when you start looking around, if I look at someone with my eyes, I can't necessarily see that they have a liver gallbladder unless they have really yellow cast to their eyes and their skin starts turning green. But if you have ultrasound, you can see immediately how many people have sludge and junk just building up in these organs. So the liver produces bile, which neutralizes stomach acids, right? The stomach has all this acid to break down and sterilize, and then it's meant to be immediately neutralized by the bile. And then when people don't have that bile to secrete into it, they end up burning the rest of their gut because the rest of the gut doesn't have the mucus layer that the stomach has to protect against acids. So the liver produces the bile to neutralize stomach acids, kill parasites, stimulate peristalsis, digest fats. And the gallbladder is that little bag, that sac that the bile goes into. And then it kind of gets squirted on demand into the intestines as the food goes by. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, bile in the gallbladder starts to turn to sludge. That's the initial phase of it. And then stones as they get older. And, gallstones, trapped gallstones are considered the most painful experience a human can have on the planet. And when those stones get in there, they can also, the bile has to go somewhere. Sometimes it'll start to squirt into the pancreas and burn the pancreas up. So these people end up with pancreatitis and constipation and inability to digest fat, things that you typically say, oh, well, you're just old. Well, no, you probably got some gallstones in there. Now, there's an old school protocol, just like we had an old school protocol for liver, for chemical toxicity with coffee enemas and the Zenaplex. There's an old school protocol for liver gallbladders, and it's called the liver gallbladder flush. Have you ever done one of those?
I've done, not in the way where they tell you to drink like large amounts of olive oil and all of that sort of protocol. I mean, I've seen them. I've got my own personal concerns around some of those things, and I just think you can do them in better ways. So
yeah. Okay. So the detox that Dr. Jason is talking about is an old school protocol where you sometimes you'll presage it, you'll do it ahead of time, you'll prepare it with a bunch of malic acid from apple juice. But eventually what you do is you drink like a half a cup of olive oil with Epsom salts and maybe some lemon juice. And the idea is that the olive oil causes the gallbladder and the liver to say, oh, that's a lot of oil, we better dump all our bile. The Epsom salt dilates the sphincter that holds the gallbladder closed, called the sphincter of Oddi, and you give birth to, you expel out all of these stones. Now, there's some issues with this. One, it's not an enjoyable process. I mean, the expulsion of the stones isn't bad, but drinking that concoction,
if you can keep it down,
if you can keep it down, that's nasty. And here's the second thing. Yes, you'll get stones out that way, but some of what comes out are just coagulated bits of olive oil. So the person will do this flush, and they're told, keep doing flushes until you don't get stones out. Yeah. And they'll keep getting more and more stones, which are what they're making. And because it's artifact. And this is a third kind of detox trap, which is when the detox actually causes the problem it's trying to resolve. Another example of this would be some people might use toxic zeolite or chlorella. Now, zeolite is mined out of the earth. And yes, it binds toxic metals, but there's toxic metals in the earth. So if that zeolite company didn't
Right.
properly acid wash their zeolite, and then you eat the zeolite, and it hits the acid of the stomach and releases all the toxins it had in it. And then you check this person's urine, and then you say, wow, look at all the toxins that are being removed. No, those are the toxins you put in, right? Or the same thing with the chlorella. If the chlorella was grown in ocean, in seawater off the coast of China by a bunch of factories, it's going to be full of junk, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, and you know what happens is people, and it's the same thing for this kind of trap as it happens with the people that just do phase 1 and not phase 2. They'll start feeling terrible, and their health coach will say, "Oh, you're in a healing crisis. Just push through it, and you'll get out the other side." And they keep doing it, and the more they do, the worse they feel, and eventually they can't barely even stand up anymore, and they give up, and they say that, you know, they think that they failed somehow, that they lacked the will or discipline to do it. No, they were poisoning themselves, either because they had a phase 2 crash, or because the detox they thought they were taking was actually what was causing the problem. Okay,
Yeah.
so, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm like, all right, what can we do to make a better version of this? So I took a whole bunch of ingredients and herbs that work at dissolving crystallizations of the body, not just the liver, but also the kidneys, heck, everywhere. And again, why a suppository? Well, there's nothing in the product's called glytamins. There's nothing in glytamins that you couldn't eat. And, you know, when I make a run of glytamins and every once in a while I'll have a cosmetic defect, you know, I'll eat them, you know, but because digestion won't destroy any ingredients in that particular product. But in this case, it's location, right? I want to get right to the liver. And there is something with the portal vein is right in the rectum. And, you know, it gives about 1/3 of the blood to the liver. So, you know, you get an enormous amount of, blood going through the liver with the portal vein. And so it gives you access to the liver in that way. And so by location, a suppository is fantastic for the liver. So we do that, and you know, I'll tell you a story. There was this one 70-year-old woman, and she wanted to tell me, she wanted to thank me because her headaches went away. And I said, wow, well, I'm really happy for you. She goes, no, thank you. My headaches are gone. I'm like, well, gosh, that must have been a terrible headache you had. She goes, well, I've had it for 55 years. I'm like, you had a headache for 55 years? She goes, yeah, and it's gone? She goes, yeah. I'm like, you had a gallstone and when you were 15 and okay, wow. Because all right, if you look in Chinese medicine, you find that the gallbladder meridian goes up behind the head. And a lot of times people with problems with their gallbladder meridian end up with headaches. And if you ever get into neurotherapy and you inject scars along the gallbladder line, you can make the headaches go away. It's another story. So anyway, you know, I'm glad the woman, I'm sorry she was in pain for all of her life, but I'm glad that her twilight years, at least she was free of a headache. So yeah, you can flush it out. Now, we don't normally, when you use the glytamins product, you're not necessarily going to see the same expulsion of stones unless you do a colonic and then you have one of those colonics where you can see the tube and what comes out. Then you can stimulate them. But by and large, what you're really looking to do is to melt them out. And yes, it may take a few more days than drinking the olive oil drink, but it's a bit more thorough, I think, and a lot easier to do. So, you know, the next thing on the list for calcifications, you know, we talked about would be kidney stones. And the ingredients in glytamins definitely can support the body in dealing with kidney stones. But, you know, let's talk about calcifications, because that's part of this process. Yeah. So great book called The Calcium Bomb that talks about this more in depth. You know, calcium is clearly needed for our health, but as we age, it leaves the bones and teeth where they're needed and they belong, and they start to accumulate in the soft tissue. So we literally turn to stone as we age. And there's an exponential or logarithmic increase. The older you get, the more you turn to stone. And were we to live long enough, we'd basically be statues. And, you know, so calcium does this everywhere. It's not just the kidneys, it's the arteries, it's the breast, the prostate, the joints, the brain. I mean, they have different names for them, all right? Brain sand and carni and all these different, you know, arteriosclerosis, but breast calcifications, it's the same thing. It's calcium building up. Now, sometimes it happens due to infection, sometimes to trauma, sometimes to high blood sugar, but it's just something that happens as we age, we calcify. So the question is there a way to kind of dissolve these calcium-based crystallizations, such as kidney stones? And the answer is yes. we can in fact use the same chelator that we use for toxic metals. And that's because calcium is a metal. If you look on the table of the elemental table, you'll see there's calcium in the section of metals. It's not a metal in the way you think of it in terms of like, conducting electricity and heat and being gray and ductile, blah, 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 but chemically it's a metal. So we can pull it out. And you can do that with EDTA. It bonds to calcium just fine, wonderfully, actually. Just as a note, though, 99% of the EDTA that's sold for health purposes for chelation or detox is calcium EDTA. The calcium's already on the EDTA. So if calcium EDTA bumps into calcium, there's no reaction because it's not going to exchange like for like. It needs to attract, the calcium EDTA will grab lead. It has a greater affinity for lead, but an equal affinity for calcium. So what I did and ended up getting a patent for is a magnesium potassium chelator. So our EDTA is magnesium dipotassium. So there's one magnesium with two potassiums on there, whereas most people are using sodium and calcium. And the magnesium potassium makes such a fragile bond to the EDTA that they'll fall off for anything. So if they bump into calcium, the magnesium and potassium will then fall off the EDTA and thus become nutritional elements in the body, because the body typically is low on magnesium. And now you've got calcium EDTA, and then it's pulled that out. And then what will happen is the calcium EDTA will then bump into lead, grab the lead, and let go of the calcium. And the calcium then becomes nutritional calcium. It's no longer stuck in the joints or something or in the kidneys. And so that process goes down the line like that. Now, in terms of the order, I'm often asked, like, what's the order you want to take these in? And I like to have the clients clean out their kidneys and gallbladder first before we get into any heavy detoxing, and I'll tell you why. Imagine you inherited an old house from a relative in the past, and you get in the house and you walk in, and boy, that thing has got an inch of dust in it. So you go in and you've managed, and you walk in the front door, and there's so much dust you can only get the front door in halfway because there's all this clutter. And you get in and you grab a broom and you start to sweep. Now, if you start to sweep the dust out and the door is only half open, some's going to go out the door, and half of it's going to bounce back at you and get in your eyes, your face, cough, make a mess, get in the air. You really, before you grab that broom, get the clutter away from that door, oil the hinges, get the door open all the way. Okay, now you can sweep, right? And it's the same thing in the human body. You want to make sure that, and this is what phase 3 is, phase 3 detox. You want to make sure that the main pathways out, the kidneys and the gallbladder, and for some people, the lymphatics, are clean and clear so that when you release all this stuff from the soft tissue, it spends the least amount of time in the body, because even a reacted toxin is still toxic. It's just less, so we want them out of the body as soon as possible. And that's what I would call the fourth kind of detox trap, which is when you start a detox before the pathways out the body are completely or as open as you can get them. Do you have any questions on that kind of stuff so far?
No, I think that's great. I love the breakdown of going through each one of them, and totally agree. You cannot start to detox until you got the emunctories open. They're going to be eliminating things.
So do we have time to get into oxalates and some
Yes,
other things, or do you have something else you want to talk about?
No, I definitely want to hear about oxalates. That's something that's I think that's something that's been very overlooked. And I also think it's something that, because, in the world of nutrition, there's always trends around different things. And there's with any food, superfood or not, there's benefits and there's always certain side effects. It's almost like what we like to do in North America, I find particular, is like we find something that we think is good, and then we like to go really all in and go really heavy on certain things. So I find the same thing with like certain key foods that might have lots of benefits in some regard, but people don't realize that they also have other things that might not be so beneficial either. Oxalates, I think, kind of comes into that world. So maybe you can talk a little bit about oxalates, what they are, what some of the problems are related to them, and how we can start even around detoxing oxalates.
Yeah, it's interesting that you would mention about fad diets, because that's exactly where oxalates come in from my perspective. So let me, I like historical kind of stories. So let me tell you a little story about oxalates. All right, so it's the Great Depression, right? And not a lot of, people don't have a lot of money, and I'm not sure if the Dust Bowl was happening. I don't know when the Dust Bowl was happening, if that was happening roughly the same time or not. I have to go look that up. In any case, so it's a Great Depression, and all these families are starving. And so some people thought, well, gosh, is there anything cheap and nutritious that people just aren't eating because they don't know that it's good for them? And they thought about spinach, which has an incredible nutrition profile, right? And so they said, all right, let's get people eating spinach, because before then spinach wasn't really eaten that much. And they created a PR campaign for spinach. And they did this with a cartoon character called Popeye. And so for those of you who aren't old enough to know, there is this sailor named Popeye and his girl Olive Oil, and Brutus would always come over and harass Popeye. Brutus is this big bully guy, and harass Popeye and try to take Popeye's girlfriend. And Popeye couldn't do anything about it until he grabbed a can of spinach, opened it up, ate it, and then suddenly he was super Popeye and saved the day. And so strong to the finish because I eat my spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. Okay, so great. That became a fad, and that was the fad then. And there's a fad now, right? Chia seeds and soy and almonds and beets and things. The challenge is these foods are all incredibly high in something called oxalates. Oxalates are naturally found in plants. They're part of the plant's physical structure. They're how plants sequester minerals. And some plants have a lot more than others. And the problem is these oxalates form crystals. Some of them are kind of flat and plate-like shaped, and some of them are like needles. And they can cause a lot of pain and a lot of damage wherever they go, because the human body is not designed to have needles precipitating in the tissue. So there's some foods that I think you really just shouldn't eat. Chia seeds, soy, beets, unfortunately, and spinach, rhubarb. To me, these are just so high in oxalates, caraway, certain types of seeds, cardamom. They're just so high in oxalates, just leave them alone, or just have them once in a blue moon. Now, historically, there are ways to eat them. If you cook oxalate foods with calcium, it'll bind some of it. And if you pour away the water that you cooked it in, that'll pour some away. And so like Indian food cooking will cook spinach with dairy. And because somehow they got that the dairy would bind to the oxalate and the calcium and turn into calcium oxalate, which is not very absorbable, and you won't absorb it so much to the gut. So yeah, if you're going to do oxalates, cook them with dairy, right? But let's get back to, and the other challenge is, if you look up on the tables of what foods have oxalates, you'll find the same food, different researchers will give you different answers. Some will say low, some will say medium, and some will say high. And it's not that the researchers are idiots or their equipment is wrong. It's that while some foods are always high in oxalates, some foods are conditionally high based on how they're raised. And I don't know what does it. I don't know if it's poor soil or exposure to certain pesticides. So even if you're on an oxalate-free diet and you think you are, you're probably getting oxalates in things that aren't, that don't always have oxalates, but did in the batch that you got. So it's important to know how to get rid of them. So there's an inexpensive way to do it, and that's with Epsom salts. Traditionally in the old school, they would send you if you had a certain type of condition that they didn't know it was oxalate crystals, but they knew it was associated with, they recognized the condition, and they'd say, hey, go off to hot springs, go to this particular hot spring. And because that hot spring was good for that condition. Nobody knew why. Well, what it was is there was sulfur there and magnesium there in that spring, and it got rid of the oxalate crystals in the person's body. So what happens is sulfate will displace oxalates, so it'll knock it off from what it's attached to, and magnesium makes it 200 times, more than 200 times more water soluble. So now you can displace it and urinate it out. So a really inexpensive way to deal with the oxalates is Epsom salts.
Now, would it work, Spencer, if you were to incorporate higher sulfur containing foods or even things like MSM or something like that? Would they work as well?
Yeah, salt, absolutely. Not everybody can do high amounts of sulfur, but yes, that's a great way to go. Since the oxalates, a lot of them tend to get in the muscle tissue, I think Epsom salt baths are fantastic, because there's only so much sulfur your gut can take. There's only so much magnesium you can take before you get the loose stools. But you can take enormous amounts of magnesium and sulfur through the skin. So that's my preferred way to do it. There's another way to do it. So are you familiar with grounding at all?
Yeah, it's on my list of things I want to talk to you about, because I like, when I was reading some of the work that you're doing, you're talking about voltage and electrons. I've done a lot of work with someone named Dr. Jerry Tennant in the States. Followed his work for a long time and incorporated a lot of it. And I think in a similar realm to what you've talked about. So I think it's a huge part of optimizing people's health. So yeah, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, Dr. Tennant's work is fantastic. His book
Yeah.
is excellent. So, all right. So let's imagine that you have someone who has an RV and they're a first-time owner. And the first winter, they just leave it parked in their garage. And they come back and battery's dead. They try to charge it, can't take a charge, the battery's destroyed. Okay, they need to put a new battery in. So if voltage goes down low enough, batteries can get damaged to the point where it's very hard to recover them. First lesson. Next year, they disconnect the battery. They're a little smarter the next winter. And they come back, the battery's dead, but they can charge it and it takes a charge. Battery's lost a little lifespan. Off they go, right? While they're out on their trip, they're camping out, they bump into other people with RVs, and the other RV people say, oh, they're talking about their experiences. What you really need is a trickle charger, right? What you need is, so what they do, they go buy a trickle charger, and that next winter, they disconnect the battery and put the battery on a trickle charger, meaning it's a little bit of power is going into it all the time. That way, because batteries will self-discharge. Even if they're not attached to anything, they'll lose power. And that way, not only did the battery not need to be recharged that winter, but the battery was in perfect shape. Okay, we have 30 trillion cells. Each of them are like little batteries, and the voltage is what allows the transporters you talked about earlier, the revolving doors and the pumps, to move back and forth. It all works on voltage. And cancer is highly associated with low voltage. That's a whole other conversation. So knowing how to maintain the voltage of our body is really important. So how do we do that? Well, almost every machine that's out there, if it has 2 electrodes, it's going to remove electrons from you, right? Because anytime there's a current, that creates an electron vacuum in its vicinity and it's pulling electrons out. So the keyboard in front of me, when I touch my hands to it, it's pulling electrons out of me. We're meant to get electrons, all right, so electrons come off the sun and the solar wind, hit the atmosphere, create lightning strikes, charge up the earth, and we get them through our bare feet, through the raw food we eat, and through the air we breathe, theoretically. However, we don't spend our life barefoot. The food we eat is all cooked, not that that's a bad idea, but it removes all the electrons. And the air has very little electrons left, a very little negative charge. 100 years ago it was 20% more negative than positive. Now it's 20% more positive than negative because electrons detoxify. And so they're detoxifying the air, and in so doing, they're removing some of the toxins from the air, but their number goes down. So our electron system now goes into reverse. We're supposed to get electrons through our meridians in our feet. The meridians of the body are irrigation systems for the electrons to the internal organs, but instead, all the electrons are being pulled out of us into the artificial synthetic materials we're walking on and clothing ourselves with. So our electrons are being pulled out of our organs through the meridians into the carpets, into the synthetic clothes. The air we breathe in is positively charged now, so our body has to donate electrons to our air we breathe, and so the lungs can't detoxify properly, so the lungs get full of tar and junk. And then the food we eat, we have to donate electrons for the digestive process, so now our whole body is just starving for electrons, right? So we're like the person in the first RV. We have bodies whose batteries are so bad that if we could replace them, we should, but we can't. We can't just replace 30 trillion batteries. So, I'm looking into this and I'm saying, well, what do you do if, you're in the military and you have $1 million battery on a nuclear sub? They're not going to just replace these batteries. There has to be a way to recover them. And there is, right? It's just it's expensive. So most people don't have the equipment for it, but it uses voltage spikes. So, what I've done is I built a machine that will do the second and third type of things. It will be it'll do the voltage spikes to help recover a destroyed battery, and it'll recharge the battery. In terms of the trickle charging, that's grounding, right? But grounding doesn't, just like a trickle charger, grounding won't work if the battery is really shot. And most of us, our batteries are shot. Grounding, great in theory, doesn't really work like it could because we can't absorb what it's giving us because our batteries are. The reason a battery can't receive a charge is because it crystallizes. We talked about crystals before. Crystals will form in the battery, and if enough crystals form in there, it won't take a charge. That's why, when you have a cell phone whose battery is going, the charge on the phone will last less and less time, and you can charge it, but it won't be able to take the charge. So in order to be able to take the charge, we have to take the crystals out of the body. And we can do that with things like, you can support that with things like metacardium and glytamins, but you can also do it with electrons. So I built a machine that pumps electrons out of the earth, which is the source of them, and fire hoses them into the body at up to 18,000 volts. Because we're using less than a milliamp, it's not dangerous, but it's a very high voltage, but very low current. And again, there's a lot of great machines out there, the TENS unit, Rife machines, biomodulator. There's a lot of wonderful equipment out there, but they all have 2 electrodes, which means that they're not going to raise voltage, they're actually going to lower it. So what I say is, if you're going to use all this equipment, which you should because they're great, afterwards, do something to raise the electrons, because the equipment you just used actually pulled it out of you. The way a watch works, is there's a little crystal in there, and all right, those little lighters where you click them and then they make the spark and you can light your stove. So what happens is there's a little crystal in there, and as you pull the handle or you pull the trigger, it compresses the crystal, and compressed crystals generate electricity, which is why when we walk around and we compress our bones generate electricity, which is good for us, right? So if you vibrate a crystal, it generates electricity, but that also works in reverse. If you add electricity, the crystal vibrates, which is how quartz watches, work. So what I thought is, okay, if I can vibrate the crystals in the body at the right frequency, and I can vibrate them strongly enough, I can blow them up. Now, crystals become, all crystals in the body are virtually insoluble once they reach about 7 nanometers, which is about 10,000 times smaller than a human hair. Its diameter. But if you can get them less than 7 nanometers, suddenly they become soluble. So if you can blow them up and into sub 7 nanometer sizes, now they become 10,000 times more soluble, and the body can deal with them. Now certainly so even the chelators you use will be a lot faster if you can blow these crystals up, because toxic metals will form crystals. Mercury and lead will crystallize with phosphorus and sulfur. They'll make mercury and lead sulfate and phosphate. And they don't just float, they don't just hang around on their own, they're in crystal forms. So this whole crystal thing, it's a whole new science that we're kind of rediscovering about how we can, what we can do with it. And I'll just tell you a personal story, and then when I first made it, the things I make, I normally, make them for me because I'm not feeling well in a particular way. And then if they do well, then other people want them. I make them available to the public. So I made the electron charger for myself and passed a bunch of kidney stones. That was not a comfortable experience because it broke them up. I now know to do it a little slower. And my feet got warm. And what I mean warm is, up until that time I was using an electron charger, I had to wear wool socks all day long, every day. Middle of summer, I had to wear wool socks. Going to sleep at night, middle of summer, wool socks, because my feet were so cold. And 2 weeks after using the machine, in the middle of the night, I'm like, I think my feet are warm. No, my feet aren't warm, they're hot. And I took my socks off, my feet were hot. That was such a wonderful feeling. And it only lasted for a couple of days. After that, they just kind of normalized, right? Because now my body wasn't trying to overcome the issue that it had before. And so now I got to center and my feet were just warm. And I haven't worn socks to bed now for a couple of years, which that's so nice. Definitely it was clearing the crystals out, and I could see it in my urine. I could see this cloudy mess come out of me when I first used it. And that's classic for people that are doing an oxalate flush. Sometimes if you just stop taking oxalate foods, you'll start dumping oxalates if you have enough internal strength to do it. But I was getting an oxalate flush by virtue of having enough electricity in me to crush up the crystals and just pee them all out. So that was my experience with the crystals. And there's a lot of other stories of that electricity is done that I can share with you.
I really like the aspect of voltage and using electricity and that sort of aspect of things for medicine, because it really does feel to me like you're supporting that natural ability for the body to now do what it knows how to do. But like you said, if the battery's bottomed right out, then you need to recharge it again so it can actually do the work. And one of the things I liked about the work with Dr. Jerry Tennant was where he would break down, what are the big things that drop voltage, and it's like hidden infections, scars. A lot of people don't realize, the whole fascial system of the body is one big piezoelectric battery. It's like it's designed to create charge every time we move. And when we actually create scars, it's kind of like a circuit breaker. So
Yes.
and from an osteopathic perspective, we work on scars as one of the first priorities, because if it literally creates like a almost a separate fulcrum for the body to start to create an axis around. And when that's going on, it starts to throw off a lot of problems outside of it creating a circuit breaker for these fascial chains, which are very much in line with the different Chinese meridians. So I think if you can get some of that stuff, hidden infections, scars, nutrient imbalances, some of those different things. I mean, those are and stress, mental emotional stress. That's one of the biggest ones. He would often say emotions, actually now he talks that to being actually one of the top things. He would even say the emotion that people are dealing with often makes the specific tooth that is related to that meridian and that emotion now susceptible to
Yes.
becoming a problem. So then we often send people to an environmental or a holistic dentist that will actually properly work with that and clean out, and from a lot of times these toxic root canals and some of these different problems that are developed for people that they don't even realize have this low
Mm.
grade infection that's just been drawing off voltage for often decades for some
Yeah,
people.
that's where the biomodulator, and the
Yeah.
scanner type devices really do great, is clearing up or getting the homeostasis back in the tissue so that the electrons can move. And so that technology blends really well with ours, because our technology gives the electrons, and then the biomodulator lets them move where they need to go. And so the two of them are really well suited for each other. Um, the Another thing you can do for scar tissue is an old school thing for that is castor oil. And we make
Yeah.
we have a modern version of the castor oil pack where we have it on an adhesive kind of saran wrap, so you can stick it to the body and it doesn't leak for about 2 hours. And especially for in the abdomen is a huge place, because any surgery in the abdomen is almost always going to cause a massive scar tissue. And women who've sometimes there's normal childbirth, but also abortions. So dealing with scar tissue in the abdomen, the womb for women is a huge thing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times people forget that even when they do, like say a gallbladder surgery now, when people have had that, it doesn't look like lots on the outside, but there's still lots that's taken place on the inside. So even though you don't see a massive scar in the same way, doesn't mean there's not still lots of different stuff that's gone on underneath the skin that you can't see so well. But I
Yeah.
love some of those old school remedies because they come up over and over again. It's like castor oil packs and Epsom salt baths. I mean, probably a lot of people's grandparents told them to do Epsom salt baths and castor oil packs, especially if they came from, a lot of my patients that have come from, say, like Eastern Europe or somewhere along those lines, they're well aware of a lot of that kind of stuff. And
Mm.
they're good. There's a lot of science behind them. There's a lot of clinical relevancy, just over time tested treatments. So I saw that you had a um, a version of that for a castor oil patch or something. I thought that was actually really cool. So
I, I just try to make that particular protocol a little bit more accessible, because usually the way it's done is a complete
messy.
mess and gets everywhere.
Yeah.
Castor
It's a
oil,
low
that has to,
compliance treatment.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. All the things I work on originally were trying to make low compliance great protocols available to people more easily. Our castor oil is also known as Palma Christi, or the hand of Christ,
Yeah.
because historically, that's, to call a plant the hand of Christ, it's got to have a reputation of being a very healing element. In terms of the electrons, I don't even think them as I think of them in terms of like water and air and food and water. The body was evolved, created, you take your pick, in a electron-rich environment. It never thought it was going to have to run out of electrons. So it doesn't really, we're like, unlike electric eels, we don't have a way to store electrons, right? It thought, I'm always going to have as many electrons as I want at all times. Now, the body does not think that about food, right? So we have the ability to store fat. It knows we might go through days of hunger. Okay, I'll store some fat, and if I'm going to go through a season of hunger, we'll do hibernation. We have never developed a way to deal with low voltage, because it's too new a phenomenon. It's 100 years old, 150 at most, from the beginning of rubber shoes, rubber-soled shoes, right, and such. So the body has no experience with it, and the biochemistry is like, well, gosh, I'll give you an example, like antioxidants, right? They're a very popular supplement, and what antioxidants do is they don't donate electrons, they shuttle electrons, right? So yes, they'll have one electron on them, and once they donate that electron, they're expecting to go and grab another one in a billionth or a millionth of a second, because they work that fast, and donate another one. They're just taking it from point A to point B. If a person's low on electrons, that antioxidant gets to do one trip, as opposed to a million to a billion trips per second for the lifespan of that antioxidant. So, you know, I would much rather have a normal amount of antioxidants in my system and the correct amount of electrons for them to, and an infinite supply of electrons for them to take them wherever they want, rather than be electron deficient and have one electron on the antioxidant that I swallow and then it's over with. So, and if you think about it, electrons are the smallest antioxidants, because all antioxidants are something to shuttle an electron. So if you could even bypass, in some ways, you can even bypass the antioxidant and just donate the electrons, but the electrons make it more conducive for the delivery to various parts of the body.
Right. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think this is actually an area of medicine that's going to be expanding more and more and more, and probably starting to be more utilized more readily. As I really do feel like medicine's kind of been, for a long time, has been very biochemical based, and that's really important. We've learned lots from that, and I think that's not going to go away, but I think we're going to start to look at these other areas more around things like voltage and energy and vibration and frequency. I think that's going to start to take a bigger play in medicine over this next coming years. Spencer, I feel like we could go on lots around this. And I think if we do a larger series coming down the road, I think on detoxification, cleaning out the body, I'm going to bring you back if you'd be open to that, so we can dive into a few other things. I also want to talk to you next time too, a little bit more around the 5 elements and emotions, because we could even tie that into emotional detox in some ways, because ultimately I think detoxification is on multiple levels to get all of the real benefits.
Sure.
Until then, where can people learn more about the work that you're doing? Where can they go around Remedylink? Where can they learn about some of the different products you guys are creating?
Well, thank you. So the website is Remedylink, REMEDYLINK. We've got about 18 products there. There's a video page there that, I don't know how many videos we have up now, that, you know, talk about various topics, and there's some books that you can download for free up there. So, you know, there's some resources available to you, and you know, if you have some questions about any of the products, you know, you can usually reach us by phone or by email. We're pretty easy to get a hold of when we're not in the lab making things.
Nice. Yeah, it's a great website. You've got lots of information there, and yeah, you've got a lot of videos that you've done that really they really break the information down for people so they can actually start to understand what they're doing. I always think that's important. It's like, rather than just randomly taking a product to do something that you think it's going to do, understand what's going on. You know, even around this, things like detoxification. It's why we're doing this sort of mini series on this, because a lot of people jump into detox right now, and you can do a lot of stuff that doesn't actually make you better. It can actually make you worse. That's why we talked a fair bit there around the different phases. I mean, people don't realize that the first part of detoxification actually makes things even worse than it actually makes things better. You have to have the different phases working, or else you're going to get stuck and create some problems. So go check out Remedylink. There's lots of information there. There's lots of great products. I love that you've got some of the best suppositories that I've seen. So I think that's such an also, so many people's guts do not work so well that even when they take certain things, if they haven't done certain work with their gut, they're not going to absorb what they think they're trying to get. So, you know, there's a lot of layers to it. I think the suppositories can bypass a lot of those problems for people too. And those people that have really sensitivity to taking oral supplements, this is another good way to do things. So, Spencer, what an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Jason.